So, okay, you can proceed now.
Great.
Sorry.
Yes, sure. So I was just about to say, I'm really happy that I have the opportunity to present my research. I will speak for about 30 minutes, and I will try to be slow in speaking, because I have a tendency of getting a bit paced up when I'm excited, and I'm really excited to present. So if I get too fast, or if you can't hear me properly because of connection problems, please let me know, and I will just repeat and try to slow down as well. And as I have already been introduced, so this is basically, or what I want to do today is to present an overview of a research project that I have been doing since, I would say, 8 years by now. So I also hope to finish it by mid next year and hand in or finish my book manuscript, which I'm writing up at the moment. And the research project deals with Indian humanitarianism under colonial rule. And I look specifically at armed conflicts and wars. So what I will present today will be just a part of a larger field of humanitarian history, which of course also could deal with famines or other natural disasters. But just to give you a warm up, so this is more about wars and conflicts. So would you click on the PowerPoint so that I can so that will be the outline of my talk. I will quickly introduce the topic to you, and also explain why I think it's really important to think about humanitarian history when it comes to colonial South Asia. And then I will give quick case studies for 3 different kind of humanitarianisms, which I think were important. So imperial, nationalist, and communal relief work, or selective relief work. And then in the end, I will conclude. While philanthropy and charity are well-established themes of historical study, interest in the history of humanitarian aid has only increased over the last few years. So I would say in the last 15, 20 years, we have seen that there is a huge amount of historical research in the history of humanitarianism. But in the beginning, historical works focused primarily on the West. So humanitarianism, despite acknowledging that aid practices occurred in all parts of the world at all times, it was argued humanitarianism would be a phenomenon of European or Western origin. This argument, which has been forwarded by different kinds of historians, does rarely consider non-Western forms of humanitarianism that already existed parallel to those developed in the West. So in response to this shortcoming, non-Western humanitarianisms have begun to incite new research. There are colleagues who work on the Ottoman Empire, there are colleagues working on China and Japan, but it is still a really slowly growing subfield of historical research. And yet there remains ample scope to expand this fresh field of inquiry to add to our understandings of the historical practices, ideas, consequences of African, Latin American, Middle Eastern, and Asian ways to deal with humanitarian crisis. Would you click once? So in his influential standard work, Empire of Humanity, the political scientist Michael Barnett distinguishes humanitarianism from philanthropy and charity. And could you click again? So he defines humanitarianism as a form of compassion, and he lists 3 other criteria that basically define humanitarianism, that are assistance beyond borders, a belief that such transnational action was related in some way or the other to the transcendent, and the growing organization and governments of activities designed to protect and improve humanity. And Barnett, the book is, I think, from 2011, so it is a decade old, but he has basically written the first kind of historical account of a global history of humanitarianism. And he is always taken as the one from whom basically we have started to look more properly into different ways of humanitarianism. So focusing on the time span between the early 19th to the 21st century, can you go back once? I think there was, yes. Barnett furthermore identifies 3 phases of humanitarianism, and that are imperial humanitarianism. And you see, he marks it from 1800 to 1945. So with the end of the Second World War, he says there's neo-humanitarianism from 45 to 98, basically with the end of the Cold War, tearing down of the wall, and then liberal humanitarianism from 98 until the present. So in my understanding, his framework is unsuited to describe the genesis of Indian humanitarianisms in at least 3 regards. So first, South Asia, but also in other regions, a clear-cut divide between philanthropy, charity, and humanitarianism is sometimes hard to establish, as neither the contemporary use of such terminology nor the self-understanding of aid providers were consistent. Second, Barnett's definition of humanitarianism is clearly looking at assistance that crosses borders, but that appears too narrow, especially because he understands this border crossing as geographically, or crossing borders, so means markers of geographically and politically defined spaces. But giving aid to people residing in different regions of the same nation or empire, or to people belonging to the same, to another religion, ethnicity, language group, caste, means, of course, not technically overcoming these geographical or political borders, yet it meant crossing considerably social, religious, economic boundaries and barriers nevertheless. And I think this is for different contexts, for instance, when we think about South Asia, really important. And third, Barnett's periodization of humanitarianism, if read against non-European histories, appears simplistic and occasionally unfitting. So in the case of South Asian aid initiatives during the late colonial rule, the conceptual label of imperial humanitarianism, if we apply only this, then it would obscure other humanitarian practices and ideas that were driven by nationalist, internationalist, and communal actors and agendas. So research on Indian humanitarianism can add new layers of complexity to our understanding when we think about the broader phenomenon of humanitarianism. So what I want to do in my talk is to give you an overview of this emergent subfield. And as I already said, I will discuss three different varieties, so the imperial, the nationalist, and the communal, to emphasize the plurality of motivations and practices of aid under late colonial rule. So, and now, could you click, please? Okay, now we are with the first category, the imperial humanitarianism. So Indians began to provide aid in armed conflicts beyond the subcontinent from the 1870s onwards. So although these humanitarian engagements were embedded within the nexus of the British Empire, the latter was not the only impetus of such aid giving. A colleague of mine who has worked on the Indian Red Cross and Red Crescent, Adrian Ruprecht, he has convincingly shown that for the Great Eastern Crisis, so that are the Balkan Wars of the 1870s, humanitarianism from South Asia could also be linked to motivations and solidarities that did not support the British, but other interests, so other imperial interests and also extra imperial interests. So during these wars between the Ottoman Empire and Serbia, Montenegro, and Russia, the Red Cross inspired ideas of helping wounded soldiers caused a widespread humanitarian agitation on the Indian subcontinent, not only amongst Indian Muslims, but also in Hindu circles. And there was an ensuing mass campaign that collected donation, and this mass campaign was marked by really modern practices of giving. For instance, the formation of public committees, the publication of proceedings and appeals, a systematic collection of subscriptions, and also the transfer of the money to the seat of the war. So the Indian humanitarian donations in support of the Ottoman Empire during the Balkan Wars were motivated by a variety of reasons, but clearly pan-Islamic notions and also solidarity or ideas of Muslim solidarity were really decisive. But Ruprecht would also argue, or has convincingly shown, that nationalist feelings and the question of a shared humanity and civilization did play a role. So also the aid responses to the Great Eastern Crisis had already shown ambitions for volunteering. So there was also discussion if people from India should be sent to the Ottoman Empire and basically take up voluntary work, and also concerns to prove one's own masculinities. It was only with the creation of Indian Ambulance Corps that these concerns moved to the forefront. Would you please click? So two humanitarian initiatives of Indian volunteers organized by Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, and he is in the middle row, sitting quite in the middle. I'm pretty sure you all see him. So he organized two humanitarian initiatives, one during the South African War of 1899 to 1905, and the second during the Bambata Rebellion, also in South Africa, of 1906. And these two initiatives tapped into the complex politics of male self-empowerment. As the British portrayed Indians in general and Hindus in particular as effeminate and weak, Indians perceived the ambulance work as an opportunity to demonstrate their courage and manliness. And alongside this, for Gandhi, a reason to organize the Corps was that he strongly linked humanitarian support rendered to the British war effort with his belief that there is a moral obligation of an imperial subject to be loyal to the empire, and this loyalty could also be expressed by volunteering in times of crisis. Of course, later he abandoned this idea. And this loyalty could also then be referred to in claims of equal political and civil right. So the idea was that as an imperial subject loyal to the empire, I have, of course, certain obligations as a citizen that I have to do. But once I do this, for instance, volunteering in the times of crisis, I can also claim certain rights for myself. So this reference to the rights and obligations of citizenship continued to mark South Asian practices and ideas of humanitarian aid in late colonial India. Also, the meanings of citizenship and also the scales of humanitarianism could vary greatly. The first medical missions organized by Indian Muslims in Great Britain and on the subcontinent appeared then again in the wake of first the Italian invasion of Ottoman Tripolitania, that was in 1911-1912, and then during the Balkan Wars, so the Second Balkan Wars in 1912 and 13. And would you click, I have another picture from, yes, so this is the Indian medical mission basically sent from the subcontinent to Constantinople in 1912, and it was led by Muqtar Ahmed Ansari. And the interesting thing is, so the Indian medical mission goes from India to the Ottoman Empire. It basically serves and cares for wounded Ottoman soldiers, but also takes care for Muslim refugees, basically, who are driven out during the wars. And once the mission reaches Constantinople, they are received in a way as coming from an independent country. So the mission itself had a really high symbolic value in this moment because they were not seen as coming from any colonial country. And here in these two instances of the Ottoman Tripolitania and then the Balkan Wars, pan-Islamism and a critical stance towards European imperialism were driving forces behind the initiatives, which created what Ruprecht calls an interconnected Islamic Red Crescent sphere. And this Red Crescent sphere was strongly sustained by Indian donations. So the nations coming from India had the largest share in general donations for this kind of medical voluntarism during the Balkan Wars. Also, the British colonial authorities reacted with suspicion. They did not prohibit the humanitarian engagement of Indians. The work of the Indian civil society at this and also at later points was shaped, of course, by its relationship with the British Indian state. And the state generally aimed to control giving, but also depended on it and therefore frequently also encouraged it. So it was a really complex relationship. The embeddedness of Indian non-state humanitarian work in the colonial states and also within the imperial structures came even more to the forefront during the First World War. So after the British Indian government had decided that India would join the war in August 1914, the colony's contribution of men, materials, and money became a crucial source of supply for the Allied powers and also involved significant repercussions for the colonial rulers and the ruled. I'm pretty sure you all know there was a major involvement of Indian combatants and non-combatants, first in the European and later in the Mesopotamian and East African theaters of the war. And this major deployment soon confronted the British with an army of wounded and sick Indian soldiers. I have a picture. Would you click once forward? So for the, can you move the PowerPoint one? Yes, thank you. So here you see wounded Indian soldiers in the hospital in Brighton, which is in Britain, which became one of the hospitals created only for Indian soldiers after they had been wounded in France on the European front. So for the soldiers' medical treatment, the British were ill-prepared in the beginning of the war. While both London and Delhi strove to improve conditions for the Indian war participants, voluntary humanitarian initiatives mushroomed and commenced to assist both their fellow Indian countrymen as well as military and other civilian victims of the war. The most common way to aid sufferers and hence to support the war effort in India voluntarily were donations in cash and also in kind to the manifold war charities set up during the war. However, Indian men and women often, but not always in cooperation with British and other European residents in India, also give their time and labor for participating in non-state humanitarian relief work. They were, for instance, members or also supporters of the Indian St. John Ambulance Association, the YMCA, the WCA, the Bengal Ambulance Corps, or Gandhi's Indian Field Ambulance Training Corps. And I have also some pictures if you would move the PowerPoint. So that are two pictures of the Indian Field Ambulance Training Corps. That was a small unit of approximately 220 people, mostly students in Britain, who basically became involved in humanitarian ambulance work and cared for Indian soldiers until mid-1915. And of course, we also have organizations like the Women's Branch of the Bombay War Fund who become active. So on the subcontinent, British and Indian women undertook, as Zara Ansari has emphasized, a staggering amount of activity, and their engagement, and I quote, mirrored what came to be expected of and associated with women on the home front in Britain and elsewhere, end of quote. So basically, Indian women took up the same kind of war work at the home front than we would see all over the globe. Would you move the slide? And so this is a picture, for instance, so you can see practical workers for the Red Cross, and you see the Rani of Kankina and members of the family busy making Red Cross bandages, bed sheets, and so on. Concretely, as one can see, women became active in garment making and socks knitting, but they also packed first aid bags, collected donations, they organized entertainments and comforts, they distributed food and comfort bags amongst returnees, they formed hospital visitors groups, and they helped with the Red Cross inquiry services. Indian male volunteers also engaged in various of these activities, but additionally, they formed several ambulance initiatives which assisted the wounded and sick soldiers in Europe, Mesopotamia, and India, and they also worked for upkeeping the morale of the fighting groups. Would you click once more, please? And this is, for instance, the Bengal Ambulance Corps, which was a voluntary initiative formed with volunteers from Calcutta who were sent to Mesopotamia and almost for a year ran there a war hospital for over 1,000 wounded Indian soldiers. So during the Great War, Indian humanitarian war work occurred in an imperial frame, albeit without being exclusively driven by imperial motives. Invoking India's war contributions again and again, Indian nationalists put forth their demand for self-government within the empire, and thereby they displayed, as Shantanu Das has argued, a complex structure of feeling visible in a strange conjunction of imperialist zeal and nationalist aspirations. And I would argue that the same strange conjunction underpinned the endeavors and work of various Indian humanitarian initiatives that were characterized by imperial loyalty, but also advocated notions of public service, nationalist efficiency, citizenship, and patriotic duties. And by postulating a degree of reciprocity, these initiatives entertained the hope for future political concessions for India. A hope that, of course, the post-war politics of the British Indian government failed to fulfill. So with the rise of the Gandhian nationalist mass movement in the 1920s, the ideas and practices of this kind of imperial humanitarianism lost some, but not all appeal for Indians, who began increasingly to engage in nationalist, communal, and internationalist forms of humanitarian aid provisions. And could you click once more? So during the Second World War, Indians worked again as volunteers for and also donated money to a number of organizations and initiatives that were still closely linked to the colonial state, such as the Indian Red Cross Society that was established in 1920, the Indian St. John Ambulance Association, or for instance here, as you can see in the air raid precaution works. However, following a rather uniform response to the imperial war effort during the Great War, Indian humanitarianism now became fragmented as alternative motivations and structures, especially those in a nationalist garb, began also to benefit the victims of war. As they had done 3 decades previously, Indian donors again contributed comprehensively to multiple war funds, Yet not all these contributions were coming forward voluntarily. This time, the extraction of cash for the war funds involved severe pressure from the governmental authorities in multiple cases, which was not only resented, but also occasionally resisted by the local population. So the Raj's approach towards voluntary giving, and that is how it basically the terminology was, further undermined feelings of imperial loyalty and questioned India's place in the common war effort. So now we move to the nationalist humanitarianism. Would you click? So the Great War and its repercussions had influenced the mainstream Indian nationalism of the Indian National Congress, which turned to Gandhi's idea of mass politics and non-violence. I mean, I'm pretty sure that's a quite common or a well-known story. India's future status was now less understood in terms of being an imperial dependency, which could develop into a dominion under colonial rule. The long-term goal in the late 1920s was to achieve independence. And this reframing of Indian nationalism went hand in hand with the reorientation of possible alliances and support networks on the international stage. And to strengthen India's claim for independence, it became important to cooperate and align with progressive anti-colonial forces worldwide. And one area to do so was the humanitarian area. There are different instances. I just concentrate here on the ones that basically are connected to China. So an early instance on Indian nationalist humanitarianism in an international conflict occurred in the context of the Chinese National Revolution in 1927, and that was something that was proposed, but it was never implemented. So as the conflict also meant a challenge for its formal presence in China, Britain responded with the dispatch of the Shanghai Defense Force that included Indian soldiers. Indian nationalists not only criticized this move as an imperialist action, but also decided to send an ambulance corps to China. Preparations were well underway when the government of India, in agreement with London, refused to grant the ambulance corps the necessary passports because they secretly feared that the proposed medical mission would serve political purposes and being basically used as a demonstration against British policy in China. And because of the stately intervention, basically that prevented any successful realization of this first instance of Indian humanitarianism in a nationalist garb. What we can already clearly see here, and it becomes even more clear when one sees the other examples, that the emerging nationalist humanitarianism was clearly politically motivated. And that is quite interesting because in the beginning, history of humanitarianism had given as the standard motivation, the kind of universal morality and feeling that one has in helping sufferers. And there was a huge discussion in the history of humanitarianism if political motivations would kind of still account then if this is proper humanitarianism or not. By now, I would say most historians agree that motivations to provide humanitarian assistance can be quite complex, and that political motivated humanitarianism is more often the case so than it's not. So the Indian National Congress aimed to demonstrate that its own foreign policy stance was different from Britain, and also with providing, or with the help of providing humanitarian aid, it wanted to underscore the country's readiness for independence. And while basically being involved in the freedom struggle, the Indian National Congress and different civil society actors also provided ideological support and financial and material humanitarian assistance for different countries, Abyssinia, for the Spanish Republic in the Spanish Civil War, and to China in the 1930s. Could you click? So in the midst of the Second Sino-Japanese War, the Congress sent a 5-doctors team, an Indian medical mission with a fully equipped ambulance car and medical supplies to China as a token of nationalist India's anti-imperialist solidarity with its neighbor. And you can see here on the left, basically the send-off picture from, I think, late August 1938 of the mission. And on the right, you see the mission member standing with Mao Zedong, who is basically the third from the right in the first row. So also the Congress initiative was closely monitored by the British government. The colonial authorities this time didn't intervene, or they only did it in a limited way, So they intercepted correspondence and they refused to grant a passport for one potential team member, but they allowed the rest to basically go to China. The state's faltering reaction seemed to be linked with the growing strength of the national movement in the late 1930s. The mission was financed by contributions collected throughout India and coming from support groups in Britain and from Indians living in Southeast Asia. And the members of the Indian medical mission worked first in China in areas held by the Kuomintang, and later, or for the longer time, it worked in communist-held Yan'an. And here the Indian humanitarians met doctors, nurses, and other personnel from Canada, the United States, Austria, Germany, Poland, etc., who likewise provided politically informed humanitarian aid to China. So what one can argue is that the work of the Indian medical mission can be understood as an important part of the global, or of a global political humanitarianism that emerged in the late 1930s. While much of this interwar nationalist humanitarianism has been forgotten, the Indian medical mission spans a significant legacy in terms of the bilateral relations between India and China. And one of its members, you might have heard of him, that's always the only member that anyone knows, actually, is Dwarkanath Kotnis, who died of epilepsy in China in late 1942. And he was quickly celebrated as a martyr to the anti-fascist cause and also became a symbol for the bond of solidarity between the two countries. Would you click once more? And the story of Dwarkanath Kotnis and also of the Indian medical mission found its way in Indian popular culture. You can see it became basically the story of Chantaram's movie, Dr. Kotnis Ki Amar Kahani. And then decades later also as a comic book titled Dr. Kotnis in China. So you can see in both cases, it's really on the one Indian humanitarian who did not come back. And the other ones are a bit forgotten, but they are not unimportant because two of them also became more aid professionals and went on to provide humanitarian aid in other occasions. So now I will quickly come to one more example, and that's a really short one, and then I would like to conclude. Would you click once more, please? So the discussion, or our discussion, of the imperial and nationalist versions of Indian humanitarianism has shown that relief work of non-state actors and organizations was often linked in many ways with the domain of the political. In a colonial situation, one of the strongest political manifestations of humanitarianism was its relationship with nationalism. So the idea that by fostering the production of patriotic citizens who cared for each other, for the nation, and for strangers in need, nation-building efforts could claim moral authority and political legitimacy against colonial rule. And that's why the engagement with humanitarianism or in humanitarianism also became so important. As different South Asian concepts of nationalism emerged, the questions of who belonged to the nation or to the imagined nation, and therefore who should receive aid and supports in times of crisis were contested, and also partially reinforced efforts to care only exclusively for one's own community. So one set of organizations that followed such a particularistic approach in relief work came from the Hindu nationalist fold, most prominent amongst them the All India Hindu Mahasabha, the political party of the Hindu nationalists. Research has just began to tap into this history. Aid initiatives by Indian Muslims during humanitarian crisis, during communal conflicts, have so far been mostly overlooked and present an important area for future research. At least I have not come across colleagues working on this. So in general, I feel that there's a lacuna of historical scholarship dealing with non-state relief work during communal conflicts and the mass violence of the partition. For the partition period, of course, we have a lot of historical accounts and also colleagues working on the state's approaches and how relief work was organized, but what non-state actors did is still an area that needs way more research. Back to the Hindu Mahasabha. So since the 1920s, community-based organizations became very active in organizing help to their community members, thus following a selective understanding of who is a citizen and who held certain citizenship duties and rights. The Hindu Mahasabha provided, for instance, relief for Hindu victims only in the aftermath of communal violence in Nagpur in 1927. And after the so-called Great Calcutta killings in August 1946, and also with the spreading violence throughout British India, the political party again took up the work of aiding wounded victims, but only, of course, Hindu victims, I mean, in their logic, and also provided relief for displaced Hindu refugees in Bengal. Would you click once more, please? And so these are two pictures basically from Hindu Mahasabha relief works. One is a hospital and one is then a relief center that basically were established in Noakhali after the communal violence had spread there. So in the following months, so before, during, and after the partition, the Hindu Mahasabha, but also other associated Hindu nationalist organizations extended their relief work and granted similar assistance in North and West India. Their assistance was framed in exclusionary terms, and it was coupled with the vision of a Hindu nation. And also the Hindu Mahasabha continued to favor this selective approach of giving aid provisions only for Hindu victims. Humanitarian and also political competition with mainstream Indian nationalism soon influenced its aid practices. So after independence, after August 1947, the party basically tried to cooperate with other humanitarian actors who followed a non-selective approach, who basically gave out aid to everyone. And this must be understood in my argument against the Hindu Mahasabha's desire that its relief work should also be recognized by the post-colonial government and the Indian people as basically a part of a national framework of aid. So not just as an exclusionary aid. Okay, I need basically 1 minute to zoom up, and then I look forward to your questions. So focusing on aid rendered during armed conflicts, I tried to introduce, or I aim to introduce in my talk today, 3 varieties of South Asian humanitarianism, which were imperial, nationalist, and communal or selective. These different forms of assistance sometimes cross geographical and political borders. However, often Indian humanitarian giving assisted fellow citizens, and in doing so, rather transcended barriers that were social, religious, or economic in nature. But at the same time, when we think about the communal relief work, we have humanitarianism that established and tightened boundaries because the assistance targeted only one particular group of recipients. Beyond the imperial, nationalist, and communal frame of reference, the chosen case studies have hopefully also shown that the activities of humanitarian organizers, volunteers, and donors followed a plethora of motivations. So morality, ethics, questions of masculinity, the extension of social spaces and gender roles, patriotism, notion of public service, national efficiency, anti-colonial resistance, and so forth. So it's not just this universal idea of helping sufferers. The work of non-state humanitarian organizations and actors clearly occurred within the limits set by the colonial states, and during the partition also the early post-colonial state, but they also likewise point to the complex relationship of Indian humanitarianism and colonialism that range basically from cooperation, loyal cooperation, to critical dissent and rejection. And finally, and I think this is one of the points that is almost most important to me, because in my work, especially if I speak with other scholars working on humanitarianism, non-Western humanitarianism still seems to be a complete outsider in the overall history. So I think that writing the history of Indian humanitarianism is still a novel undertaking. It needs way more research. I think that research into Indian humanitarianism will not only, or can not only contribute to, but even shift the arguments about humanitarian giving, arguments that were established when we are, or when through using Eurocentric lenses, as this has done or has been done so far. And now thanks for your attention, and I really look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Maria, for this wonderful, what I should say, the archival research. These are really important documents to understand that time and the different angularities and dimensions that you brought in this whole exercise of understanding South Asian colonial South Asian history, to be more precise, from the perspective of the history of humanitarian aids and other things. Because as you mentioned in your chapter and also in your presentation, that so far historians have looked into humanitarian aid as purely as an Eurocentric exercise, but they have overlooked the South Asian chapter of humanitarian aid. Now, I just some of the questions from my end, and then I will open it up for others to follow. Um, you mentioned about the traditional, when talking about Indian humanitarianism, you did talk about the traditional system of dana, then sheba and viksha. These are the traditional concepts that Indians have followed since ancient times. And you have rightly argued that how during the colonial period, as you classified it into the imperial, then the nationalist, and then the communal segment, how it evolved over the years through the different, careers of history. So my question is that how do you see through your research these, traditional elements evolving into newer modes? I mean, do you see that the earlier traces are completely erased in the new formation, in the new avatar of humanitarian aid under colonial rule, or during the nationalist movement, or during the tensions of communal conflict during 1946 and 1947? Um, this is also connected to my next question, which is in one of the references in the footnotes in the bibliography in your chapter on this particular subject, you did mention about the non-aligned movement and the Bandung conference. So because you have referred so much to China, to India's relations with other countries during the Spanish War, the Abyssinia War. I could remember that you mentioned in the footnotes about, if I'm not mistaken, Nehru talking about, observing the Abyssinia Day. So this is amazing in the sense that how the emerging Indian nationalist or post-colonialist state was visualizing the role for post-colonial India for a non-aligned future, and how humanitarian aid can play a big role in promoting that non-aligned agenda. And that was exactly what was discussed in the Bandung conference as well, that how you can think of a non-aligned Pan-African, Pan-Asian combination of nations who can challenge the supremacy and hegemony of Euro-American rule. So how do you see the success of these humanitarian exercises in actualizing this non-aligned dream, which was later executed by Nehru and others? And this also connects me to the larger question of international fraternity, because I could see that when you were sharing the screen, there was one picture of Dr. Kotnis, if I'm not mistaken, or it's in the China mission, the India-China mission, and there's someone was holding a piece of cloth where the word fraternity was written. So it's interesting that yesterday Sruti Kapila was talking about fraternity and violence, and even in today's lecture, in your presentation, the same theme of fraternity, Pan-Asian, Pan-African cooperation and fraternity is being talked about. So my question is that how could this tradition of humanitarian aid could help in the consolidation of this international fraternity, this international understanding, mutual peace, something that Derrida referred to in his essay on the gift, or on the politics of friendship. So when we were talking about seva, when we were talking about charity or humanitarian aid, we are actually talking about what Derrida talked of in his philosophical understanding of the idea of the gift, or the politics of friendship. So my question is that how do you see this tradition or this long history of humanitarian aid helping in the promotion of larger global amity and global peace and mutual understanding. So these couple of questions as of now. So if you'd like to answer it first. Thank you.
Yes, thanks for your questions. And I mean, they all are actually quite big, so I will try to answer. And I also think I will have to think more deeply about some of them. So with the first one, with the traditional system, I mean, I'm unfortunately not an expert on the 18th and 19th century colonial history, but of course I have read a lot also writing on humanitarianism, and I do believe that the traditional system was not abandoned. So the ideas of charity and philanthropy, what I said, kind of intermingle with what humanitarianism is. And I would also argue that this is something which is not only there for the South Asian context. That is also something that we see within the British context and other contexts. So the idea that philanthropy and charity works within the own community, so that I give, for instance, to some poor people, or I give to certain, against the background of certain religious days, a certain share of my income and so on and so forth to certain members of my community who are not so well off, or I give to certain causes. I think this is something that has occurred all over the world. And I do believe that it is coupled with what we understand now as humanitarianism. Also, I also try to explain that Barnett's definition doesn't make, for me, for instance, so much sense when we think about a nation or a country like India, which is so huge by itself and so diverse by itself. So that the idea that if I give to a member of my own community, but who lives like 2,000 kilometers away, is this still, this is a charity or is this humanitarianism? Does it cross certain boundaries? So for me, this is really tricky. But I have to say that these kind of organizations, for instance, the Indian St. John Ambulance Association, the Red Cross, but also other associations and organizations, when they were not doing their work during the wars, of course, they also did the same kind of work in other occasions. So for instance, during religious festivals. So we have in the Indian St. John Ambulance Association so-called women and nursing corps, and they go to the mailers and basically take care there of wounded or of people who are a bit exhausted and so on and so forth. Then it comes more with the idea of doing some service. It's not humanitarianism. So I think what starts happening from the late 19th century onwards is there's a conflation of things that we think it's humanitarian and practices that come way more with the idea of having certain kind of charity or philanthropical ideas. That also becomes very clear when one thinks about later humanitarian missions. For instance, the Indian National Congress sends another mission in 1946, so after the end of the Second World War, to Malaya. And if we read across the public appeals to fund this mission, I do feel that charity and philanthropy plays a big role, because the first idea of recipients are the poor Indian not endangered laborers, the poor Indian laborers living on certain kind of estates in Malaya, and they are always framed within that as our community. We have basically we have this kind of obligation towards our community to help them, but very soon the Indian National Congress understands that to be, and I think this is then also that already links up again to the non-alignment idea and to the idea of fraternity and brotherhood. The Indian National Congress soon starts understanding that there is a bigger politics behind it at play. So sending from India a medical mission that only cares for Indian worker in a multi-communal state like Malaya would send a really wrong picture, and would also not basically push forward then Congress's claim to be the future government of India, or basically can be part of the government. So what they do in the end is that they make sure that they care for Chinese, for Malayan, and for Indians. And they kind of stop using the kind of philanthropic charity kind of discourse, and rather open it up and say, this is again something that is really important, because it's an internationalist approach, and we are part of one community of suppressed colonial people who soon hopefully will be independent, and this becomes the angle. So there we see a shift from caring for one's own community within an idea of, we have to provide charity to, we open up and we basically go beyond these borders and we have a different kind of approach. And what you said about Bandung, I mean, I do believe that there is a prehistory from, I mean, some colleagues argue basically from the Brussels Congress against imperialism, so from the League Against Imperialism over the 1930s towards Bandung, so that Indian political thinkers, but also other political thinkers and politicians in China and then in later Vietnam and so on, start seeing what kind of anti-colonial solidarity is important to bring forward. And yes, one of my arguments would be that humanitarianism, or to provide humanitarian aid. And I mean, it's never big. I mean, in terms of money, in terms of what is put forward, it's not that 1,000 people are sent. I mean, there are small units that are sent, but the symbolic value of these units, by claiming that we belong to one anti-colonial brotherhood, we are basically directed against Western imperialist powers. We do fight for independence, and we do support your struggle for independence. That has a huge symbolic value. And this is something that basically is part of the Bandung, or part of the non-aligned history, I would definitely argue. And the last question is a really tricky one, because I mean, when I started being interested in the history, and especially after I had worked on fascism during my PhD, I thought, oh, I want to work on something nice, inspiring. And somehow I felt that humanitarianism could be one of the things. Now, after 8 years, I have to say, of course, the basic idea to provide help to others is a really good and interesting one. But as I also have said, mostly because human beings always have other agendas. So it's not just about fraternity. I would say the practices and politics of friendship, yes, it is really important, but at the same time, I do try to see always the different motives, because I believe that is the thing that is way more interesting. Why do certain people decide to volunteer to go somewhere? Why do certain people decide to donate money to send a mission to China? Friendship is important. This idea of anti-colonial solidarity is really important. I think helping, and again, coming from tradition of giving to other people something, is important. But the gain that comes out of it, basically to show that India is civilized, and that is something that is also used as a word, civilized enough to basically care for themselves because they can care for others in conflict, is also a really important point, and has nothing to do with an idea of only friendship and fraternity. So I think we see a conflation of a lot of things coming together in humanitarianism. And I find it always really interesting to rather scratch at the surface and see what are the underlying ideas and why do people engage, and what is maybe a second or a third set of motivations why people do certain things. Yes, so thank you.
Thank you so much. Just one more question from my end before I go to the chat box, which is that you said that there is a paucity of research in this particular domain, and you mentioned the Hindu Mahasabha and their role during the communal conflict in 1946. Could you find any Islamic organizations doing similar kind of charity activities during that time?
I know, I mean, interestingly, with the Hindu Mahasabha was that, and now I have to see that I'm not mixing up things, because it has been a while that I read the sources, but I know that the Hindu Mahasabha, together with the RSS, also implemented certain kind of defense leagues, and these defense leagues, interestingly, while of course instigating violence, at the same time provided humanitarian aid to Hindu victims. And I know when I read this in a couple of newspapers for Calcutta, then the Muslim League in this moment also had a similar kind of defense organization that also gave out aid to the Muslim population. I have to check on the name. I know I have read it somewhere, and I know in which piles of my sources it is, but I cannot come up. So I think this would be a really interesting start. But I also know that when it comes to partition, and I know there has been by Elisabeth Job EOP, a book on the humanitarian aid in Pakistan after the partition. So from 47, I think she goes until the early 50s. And she has written about it, but she looks mostly how the provincial governments and the government, of course, of Pakistan then organizes this. I'm not sure how much she has looked at non-state actors, how much they have been involved. I know that, interestingly, so I would think that parts of the non-state organizations that become active in India after partition, so for instance, the St. John Ambulance and also the Indian Red Cross, they are not split. So it's not that we have at the same time a Pakistani branch emerging after partition. And this leads to, for instance, the British Red Cross Society being active in Pakistan, while the Indian state clearly says we don't want the British Red Cross Society, which is also a non-state actor, but of course an international one. We don't want help. We have our own Red Cross Society. In Pakistan, the British Red Cross Society is active the first few years, because I think it takes a bit longer until the Pakistani Red Crescent Society is built up. So I think writing for Pakistan or for Muslim organizations is still something that really one has to look into it more deeper.
Thank you, Maria. So I'll go to the chat box now for having a look at the questions. The first one is from Manus Datta, and says he thanks you for your wonderful presentation. And then he said you have mentioned Hindu Mahasabha in particular to offer humanitarian works, or rather participated in the philanthropy of helping others. Did you come across any other organizations, especially religious groups in India, that were part of this humanitarian works? Also, could you say something about the role played by the Muslim League to do such humanitarian works, as the Muslim League was also crucial during this phase to do relief work, especially in undivided Bengal? What is your take in this regard? Even the Hajj pilgrimage under colonial times was largely based on humanitarian works or philanthropy. So what is the difference between humanitarian exercise and philanthropy?
Okay, I think, I mean, partly this connects and links to the questions that you have already asked. So other, of course, I mean, there are different kind of religious organizations that get active. So I mean, I have to say I have only started working on, I mean, I have said I work on it for long, but I have concentrated on a few organizations. I mean, I can dig up the name of the Muslim organization that has now slipped my mind, and I can send it to you, or also if the others want to write me an email and provide for it. I know that there are Parsis in Bombay who are really active in philanthropic work. I know that there are some Jewish organizations that also provide in the interwar period. So the Jewish Relief Administration that provides relief work for Jewish refugees coming from Europe. I have not looked because of the language, not the issue, but the language that I speak. I mean, I do speak a bit of Hindi, or I can read it, but I have never learned Urdu. So there was a certain decision what kind of research I'm doing. So I haven't looked so much into Muslim organizations yet. And as for the difference between philanthropy and humanitarianism, so again, I think within philanthropy, you have different kind of activities that go way beyond what humanitarianism does, because humanitarianism seems to be also often given for a short term and during a crisis. A philanthropy, if it's, for instance, during the Hajj, or if it's during certain religious festivals, or is it basically for orphanages, or against some kind of educational issues or aims that you have, spends often a way longer period, and goes also into areas where I would say it's not a particular and urgent crisis. So one can also argue again, instead of that, the division between philanthropy, charity, and humanitarianism is not just that it crosses borders, or that it's for distant, unknown people. I would also argue it depends how long the kind of activity is planned for. And one more thing, as I said, is that so basically, what is the reason? What is the motivation? A war or providing help during communal conflicts, other conflicts in war, requires a different kind of setup of organizations, a different kind of training, and also a different kind of giving than, for instance, saying, I support an orphanage or I support the education activities of a certain organization. So I do think that often you're right, they're the same kind of actors and organizations, but in the end, I would say there are also some distinctly different areas where people do work, if you do philanthropic work or if you do humanitarian work.
Thank you. So I'll go to the next one. The next question is by Richa Vishwas. Thank you so much for your presentation. My query is, while tracing the genealogy of Indian humanitarianism, have you seen any kind of gender ascription to the humanitarian activities over the time?
Yes. Okay, thank you again. That is a really huge question. It's a really long question. I mean, I do try to trace in my book how gender roles have changed due to engagement in humanitarianism, and also what kind of motivations are coupled with gender roles when it comes to humanitarianism. I mean, I've scratched a bit on the question of masculinity that did play a huge role for certain kind of providers of humanitarian aid. As I've said, so during the First World War, for instance, as you might know, I mean, in India, it was the British Indian Army. Not everyone could, of course, join. There was the idea of martial races, so only certain kind of communities, certain kinds of group could join. And for the people who basically were outside these groups, one way of coming closer to the army, one way of receiving some kind of military training, one way of basically proving manliness and courage is to become active as a humanitarian worker, as a volunteer in ambulance work, because you are near the front, you have to basically comply to certain kind of military standards, you work with the army, and this is the closest you can get to. On the other hand, what I feel when it comes to women and gender roles in humanitarianism, especially during the First World War, what the First World War does is that and this is something that we not only see in South Asia, that we see also in Britain and in Europe, in America, that engaging in humanitarian work is something that reinforces certain gender hierarchies and roles and stereotypes, and at the same time, it opens and challenges them. So in South Asia, when women decide to go to hospitals and to see basically unknown soldiers there and to visit them, or to organize aid for them, or to hand out comforts, this is of course something that often breaks down certain kind of barriers and traditional kind of roles, and also enables women to be way more active in going out of the house. At the same time, the idea how women are depicted is often in the traditional roles as giving care and being basically also really good in giving care. So we have this weird coming together of reinforcing gender roles and at the same time opening. And this is something that, I mean, I've looked to humanitarian practices until partition, and this is something that you can see during the Second World War. Also, I would say there the loosening factor, there the opening factor is way bigger than in the First World War. And during partition, again, both these kind of forces are at work, that certain ideas of how women should behave, what are traditional kind of practices, how a woman should behave, what they should work, how they should go out, how they should behave, are reinforced by humanitarian practices. But also on the other hand, during the partition, for instance, female social workers, that becomes a profession that becomes so normal that, you know, it also challenges certain kind of boundaries that were there before and open up new professional opportunities for women, for instance. So both is possible.
Thank you. So the next question is by Dhritiman Chakraborty, and his question is that My question is, can you think of humanitarian aids without ideological, political, or for that matter, any other discursive mediation? If not, should we therefore dig more into the term humanitarian in the first place? Do such inquiries lead us to any alternative idea of building fraternity, solidarity based on caregiving, love, and so on? Is there any archival resource for such thinking in Indian past?
Again, I mean, these questions are all huge, and as I said, I have just started working, and I hope that a lot of people will come after me to answer these questions as well. What I have seen in my sources is that I do believe that there are always more than one motivation why one person engages in humanitarianism, and even if you think that you, or even if a donor, if a supporter gives money because you think this is your religious obligation, it is not free of the motivation of being basically within a certain idea. So for me, what I have seen and also read in my sources is that it's hardly ideological free or political free that humanitarian aid is given or humanitarianism is practiced. But for me, that is also not a problem in the first place. And I do think that this idea that I can help others and that I do care and love someone and want to the best for it and basically want to engage in helping suffering humanity is not disqualified if other motivations come together with it. But I do think that one should rethink questions of solidarity and also of fraternity. An archival resource for such thinking. Well, I mean, one can start looking at the different kind of humanitarian organizations, also different kind of organizations active in charity and philanthropy and how they kind of rationalize their work. But I do have to say that often the organizations, what kind of sources do we have left, is often more reports of their work done, which have really standardized forms of explaining why certain work is done. And this is also part of the problem because it kind of also silences then the voices, of course, of the recipients and often the voices of the people beyond the official organizers who are active. Still, I think it is worth to explore the history of the organizations that are there better, but then read it against the grain and try to also find biographies and newspaper articles and so on to kind of balance it out in a certain way. I'm not basically falling into the trap of just taking over what the organization have written, because of course they have a certain audiences and in their reports they also target or they give certain explanations that they think that the audience wants to listen to, and maybe also then silence certain other motivations which are at work at the same time. But I will still thinking about it still.
Okay, thank you. The next one is by Sanchoita Paul Chakraborty. It is, he thanks you for your talk. And then can you kindly elaborate women's humanitarian work during the nationalist struggle? As we know that all India Women's Association and Bharat Stree Mahamandal were already operating during this time. You have already, I guess, referred to this in the previous question, but she has mentioned two specific organizations. So, yes.
Yes. So I cannot say a lot about this because I have basically, when I started the research, I had chosen a few organizations, then I have tried to follow them. I have picked up the sources, but of course there's a plethora of organizations one can look at. I know that the All India Women's Association was quite active. The kind of case studies I have shown, especially the ones that are sent abroad, so for instance to China, interestingly, women are really active in organizing the aid collections. So the All India Women's Association has, of course, some kind of appeals. They ask their members to donate. I know that the Desh Civikas, they go from house to house and they collect money and so on and so forth. But there is no question of sending a female doctor to China. I mean, I haven't found any discussion within the sources of the Indian National Congress that I had seen in Timurti, even discussing it. This changed interestingly during the 46th mission to Malaya, when the All India Women's Association and Mirdula Sarabhai writes to the organizers of the mission and asks, so why is there no woman in this whole team that is sent? So how is it that Indian humanitarianism abroad is presented only in sending men and only in male terms in a certain way? And interestingly, the organizers get back to her saying that that they of course acknowledge what Indian women have done during the freedom struggle or the nationalist movement, and also what they have done during the war years, and they are aware how brave and equal Indian women are. But in a certain way, they say that the Malayan government is not allowing any woman to join or to come in. And again, there is no proof, as far as I've seen sources, that the Malayan government and also the Indian government, the still colonial government in this point in time, would say women are not allowed to go. So there is a bit of a conundrum, but it does seem to me that also there is this kind of discourse on equality after the end of the Second World War, at least when it comes to the Indian National Congress, and Indian women nationalists really demand it and fight for it. They are excluded by their male colleagues when it comes to being, to going abroad on these humanitarian missions. But of course, within India and Indian women, the All India Women's Association during the war, they organize courses and help, courses in nursing, and also helping to care for wounded soldiers. And there's the Atma Raksha Mahila Samiti, I think, in Calcutta, who is really active and also providing aid during the communal violence. And we have a women's course in the Indian Red Cross and in the Indian St. John Ambulance Association, where also nationalist women basically are part of it. And they do provide nursing work, they do provide humanitarian aid. So women do play a role. But the interesting part is that they are not allowed, or that they're not included in this kind of representative humanitarianism when it comes of basically sending Indians abroad. That is until the end of my research period, so until the end of 46, 47, they are not part of it.
Okay, thank you, Maria. Now we cannot. We can take one or two more questions because time will not permit other questions. So I'll just read out the questions that we have. Beyond this, we cannot go for newer questions. So Sanjoita has already asked one question, so I'm going to the other two. One is by Shubhendra Bhaumik. And Shubhendra says that thank you so much, Maria, for researching in such a nice and inspiring area, to your own words. I have a simple query. How would you connect humanitarianism with emotion on the one hand and rationality on the other? I do think humanitarianism is particularly interesting because it stands in between the ideas of logically conceived social responsibility on the one hand and love for one's communities of increasingly larger circles. Would you please like to comment on it? I think this is one question, and if you allow me, Maria, there is another one in the chat box. I will also read that. It's by Sudeep Roy Chaudhuri, where Sudeep asks that can we see humanitarianism as an ideology that helped to justify the colonial rule? And if we can, should we not distinguish between acts of charity, philanthropy, or the indigenous forms of Sheba, Daya, Dharma, with the organized forms of transnational compassion that is termed as humanitarianism, but actually the very basis of colonizing or colonial civilizing mission?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, both these questions are really helpful and pushing me and also are again really broad. And I think I will start with the second one and then go to the first one. Okay, I do believe that humanitarianism and certain kind of humanitarian help and aid also did help to justify colonial rule. And I think there are some historians, Alan Lester and some others, who have shown, not so much for the South Asian context, but for other contexts within the British Empire, that humanitarian ideas and humanitarianism very much help to stabilize colonial rule. For instance, when it comes to the antipodes, when it comes to South Africa and so on and so forth, because the idea is often that the humanitarian givers, the one basically who donate or who organize, are way more civilized than the others. And so this is one strand of humanitarian historical research into humanitarianism. Having said this, and I think this is really the crux of my argument, is that at the same time, I do believe, I mean, then what do we do with the humanitarianism that was given and organized and done by colonized people? And I think part of the problem still with the history of humanitarianism is that these initiatives have been overlooked. And even if colleagues agree that it's important to look at it, often the argument which I have often faced when I present in conferences, oh, this is all really interesting, but that are a few people, or that is I don't know, a few thousand rupees. I mean, it's not huge in monetary aid in the kind of personal involved. So why should we look or engage with it? But I think this is a wrong kind of argumentation, because the kind of humanitarianism organized by Indians did challenge very much colonial rule, and it started challenging it not just with the nationalist humanitarianism that basically argued that because we are civilized, because we are able to care for ourselves, we are able to do this, and we can give help to others in need. Even when one looks at the First World War and one sees the staggering amount of humanitarian aid in donations, materials, and activity provided by Indians, I do believe that that the British war effort or the Allied war effort would have suffered tremendously, because they wouldn't have got their sick soldiers so quickly back, and so on and so forth. They wouldn't have been able to care for it. It would have been a crisis within South Asia if it wouldn't have been for the non-state voluntary aid by Indians. But again, having said this, especially in the First World War, Indian humanitarianism does both. It stabilizes colonial rule by helping the colonial state to provide for its army, but at the same time, by doing so, it challenges it because it has a claim. I mean, these people are aware that the Indian state cannot provide in this moment in the way it should for its combatants. And also they, by helping out or by assisting their fellow countrymen, they stabilize colonial rule, at least for the moment. At the same time, they challenge it, because they do show that without these non-state activities, there would be a huge crisis. So it's a really interesting question, but I do think that it really depends on the perspective that one takes of what humanitarianism can do or does. The questions of emotion and rationality, I do think that both is there in humanitarianism, to be honest. I do think that for long, historical research had looked at this, especially with this idea of, let's say, a neutral, more neutral emotions or more positive emotions, that one really, for the love of sufferers, for the love of one's community, should engage in humanitarian giving. But I would argue that there is a lot of other motivations. I would not even say that they are all rational. I'm not really sure about this, because a lot of the political motivations for me are not necessarily rational. But to be honest, I really have to think more about it. I cannot comment I think, comprehensively, or maybe in a way that it would be satisfying for you. So I'm sorry, I will think about it more in future.
Okay. So I think we do not have more time to have more questions. So I'll have to thank Maria for what has been a really engaging session. We talked about various aspects of humanitarian aid and the history of it. And I think that you will be writing more, because you mentioned about neoliberal humanitarian aid. So I think it would be interesting to know further from your future work about how it played out in the neoliberal times, because recently in India, for example, various aid organizations have been banned entry because of alleged terror links and other things. Even the Ford Foundation and other organizations were not allowed to provide money for fellowships and other charitable work. So I think it is really an interesting area to work on, as you rightly said, that a lot of research is needed. So Maria, thank you so much for providing.
Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you. Thank you. So I hope that this conversation will continue and we'll keep learning from your work. Thank you. Thank you. Have a nice day, and good night, everyone, from our end. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.